Hello, welcome, good evening to this in conference with an opportunity for me once a week to address in perhaps a more informal way and style than the lectures and the usual conferences. That said, this evening, what I want to talk about this evening is a kind of serious matter, and one I feel very passionate about. Now, I know that some of you are regular viewers of my broadcast daily masses, and thus are familiar with the general themes of my homilies. And one of the things that I'm always talking about is the pursuit of holiness. And I'm aware, of course, that it's very easy, perhaps, to talk about holiness and to talk about the pursuit of holiness. But what, in practical ways, does that mean? I mean, what does that mean for people living in the 21st century? Even how do we apply that desire, and how does that marry with our lives? How do we realize that as Christians living in the 21st century? I'm just going to see if I can alter that slightly. That's better. So what I'd like to do is this evening is share with you some ideas and some thoughts about the pursuit of holiness and how it is practical and realizable, even living life as we do in this contemporary situation. You know, because I'm conscious of the fact, for example, that so often the lives of the saints that we commemorate in the liturgy almost every day speak to us of a time and context that has long since gone. You know, it was nothing in the medieval era, for example, for somebody to embrace poverty and leave all they had. Or so we think. Wasn't always that simple, but that's kind of how we kind of think sometimes, looking back at the lives of the saints, and we think, well, that was easy for them. That was, you know, but that's not so easy for me, or I can't do that, or I have dependents, or I have responsibilities, etc. So how can we, with a 21st century lifestyle, pursue holiness in a practical and reasonable way? And I think in the first instance, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, How much do I trust God? How much do I trust God? And how much do I trust myself? How much do I trust God and how much do I trust myself? And when I talk about trusting oneself, about trusting oneself, how much can I rely upon myself to think, let alone do the right thing? Now, it is true that all of us have an innate and sometimes intuitive sense of what is right and wrong. We call this our conscience, of course. But we don't always have right judgment, do we? How can I exercise right judgment in order to make the right decisions that will enable me to pursue holiness in a busy, hectic, and contemporary lifestyle? Now, hopefully, some of you are watching the Late Night Catechism series, and in which case you will know that we've been looking at the virtues. Now, so what I'm going to say is, well, of course, remember that the mother of all virtues is prudence. Prudence. Which really means to use the ability that we have to reason. And so sometimes we need to reason things out. So we need to weigh up. We need to judge. We need to make a judgment or a judgment call in weighing up our decisions, in weighing up our priorities. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing we have to remember, and I know I say this all the time, but it's fundamentally important, because if we get this wrong, nothing else will work and nothing else will make sense. The first thing to remember is that our lives are not our own. As Christians, as baptized Christians, our lives are not our own, meaning that we have been set apart by and for God. And God is supposed to God is supposed to be the first and foremost priority in our hearts and in our minds. Jesus himself said, the first and greatest commandment is this, that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. Not 10%, not 20%, not 50%, all. How do we realize that? How do we apply that in any given situation in the ordinary course of our lives? Well, here we have to understand that God is all-knowing, and I thought that was going to happen, is all-knowing and is all-merciful. So how do we weigh up? So, for example, I'd like to go to Mass, or I'd like to hear Mass, maybe via the online broadcast. But perhaps I have a dependent, perhaps I have childcare responsibilities, perhaps I have a loved one that I care for. Perhaps there is some other call on my time. I'm conscious of the fact that as a Christian, I ought to be putting God first, and that all things being reasonable otherwise, i.e. that I didn't have dependents, then there would be no question. I would attend Mass or hear Mass and fulfill that first obligation. But I can't. On this occasion, I have, responsibility. I have a dependent. I have to do something else. How do we reconcile that with fulfilling the first commandment? Here, and this, my brothers and sisters, is a good and easy ready reckoner. Always you must ask yourself the question, which is the greatest sacrifice? See, what we are called to is sacrificial loving and living for God and for others. And so when, as it were, we find it difficult to otherwise exercise judgment, for example, prioritizing, the ready reckoner, what should enable us to decide rightly or righteously, is to ask the question, which is the greatest sacrifice? Because God will appreciate whatever the sacrifice is. God will appreciate it. As always, intention is always important. So if you intend, for example, to sacrifice otherwise your heart's desire to attend or hear Mass, but to fulfill a request for help or to fulfill a duty or responsibility that you have for a dependent, or, for example, for work, if your intention to make the sacrifice, if your intention to sacrifice hearing or attending Mass is righteously motivated, then God will understand. Then God will understand. Because God understands sacrifice. God is all about sacrifice. God's love is all about sacrifice. If your intention to miss Mass is motivated entirely and reasonably justified by sacrifice, by a sacrificial act, then that's going to be okay with God. Because the second commandment is like the first. Love your neighbor as you would love yourself. But if you offer the intention to sacrifice, for example, your heart's desire to hear or attend Mass, that is more of a sacrifice than if, for example, you refused to heed the call for help, or you refuse to accede to the call on your duty or responsibility for the sake of fulfilling your own desire to hear or attend Mass. Do you see? Generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, if it means sacrificing something that you hold dear, God, on the whole, is going to be okay with that. Because God gets sacrifice. But always, of course, what matters is the intention. And the point is, for example, thinking about prioritizing God in our lives, always your default position must be that God comes first. So if you're always coming from a position that God comes first, God ordinarily would take priority. But for whatever reason, appreciable reasons, justifiable reasons, you have to sacrifice, as it were, the duty and obligation that you think you would otherwise owe God in order to fulfill that act of charity, that act of sacrifice for a dependent or for another, then God actually is going to be okay with that because it's sacrificial. And because your intention otherwise would be to love him first. But actually, you see how the two commandments are alike. Because actually, if you sacrifice that first intention, in other words, your heart's desire to hear Mass, if you sacrifice that for the sake of helping another, performing some act of charity for someone else, to fulfill a responsibility or a duty of care, then actually you are still loving God, even though you make that sacrifice to not hear Mass. To put it another way, What is more sacrificial? What is a greater act of sacrificial love? To ignore a call for help, or to ignore a duty or responsibility, or to help first and pray? Here, this is the beauty of St. Benedict's motto, ora et labora, because it is possible to pray and to praise God doing anything. So, for example, if your concern might be, well, ordinarily I would like to hear Mass or attend Mass to begin my day aright with God, but I can't because I have this duty of care or I have this responsibility. You're still loving God by fulfilling your duty. And you're still making an act of sacrifice for God, because even though you're sacrificing, as it were, your desire to adore him, at the same time, you are performing an act of sacrifice, of sacrificial love, in order to serve the other. And so you are still, as it were, making an act of sacrificial love. And that's what counts. That's what counts. That's what matters. But we have to understand, you have to have the default position first, which is to embrace, to accept, to acknowledge, and to recognize that God has the first call on your time. God has the first call on your heart and mind. God has the first call on your energies. And we should generally, as a default position, consider anything else a distraction and a detraction from that first obligation. So in other words, the default position for us as Christians really should be face down on the floor, worshipping and adoring God at all times. But of course, that's not practical. And neither, actually, is it absolutely necessary to manifest prioritizing God and worshipping and adoring God with your life by always being face down on the floor. Because actually, if you fulfill his commandments, if you otherwise act sacrificially, if you're otherwise always motivated by sacrificial love, and whatever else it is you are doing, then actually you are fulfilling your love of him. As long as you recognize that whatever else it is that is detracting or distracting you from that first obligation is itself an act. It is, as it were, can yet be offered as an act of sacrifice. God would rather, this is what Jesus was talking about when he was arguing with the Pharisees about healing on the Sabbath. God would rather you went and helped someone and expressed and manifested your love for God through that act of charity for the other, than he would be if you ignored that cry for help in order to worship him. But we have to be clear. We have to understand that the sacrifice involved in doing that is your sacrifice of otherwise preferring to worship God. God will appreciate your giving that up, you're sacrificing that, if, for example, it is to perform an act of sacrifice for somebody else. Now, in terms of more generally thinking about and prioritizing our day and our time, likewise, again, we must put God first. Default position is always God first. And anything else is a distraction or a detraction. And that really is a mindset that we as Christians should be striving and trying to adopt. Because at the moment, for most of us, the default position is it's my life and my time, and I'll give God a bit of it when I can. Let's be honest. That's generally how most of us think. Our first thought is not, oh, I should be always praying and praising God. It isn't, is it? But it should be. And so the practice of religion and the development of spiritual life has to be about that reorientation of the understanding of our lives. That the correct default position is loving God and is God coming first in all things. Anything else is a distraction or a detraction. But carrying that same thought through, that also means, however, that if the genuine desire on our part to love and to worship God necessitates a sacrifice of that in order to act charitably toward another, that is as acceptable. And especially when that thing that takes us away, as it were, immediately from God, we dedicate and intend to him. So if for example, normally I would be able to say the Angelus at 6 o'clock, but today I have to prepare a meal for the family. Well, two things about that. One, it's actually possible to do both at the same time. We ought to know the Angelus prayers by heart to be able to recite them by ourselves. So it is possible to ora et labora, to pray and work. So we can recite the prayers even if we're doing something else. Of course, it's preferable. Of course, it's more desirable to pause and to reflect and to pray. But if that's not possible, it's still doable to recite the Angelus. It's still possible to recall the Incarnation whilst performing some manual act. That's still possible. But secondly, as well, we can say, okay, well, I have to do this other thing, which takes me away from focusing perhaps wholeheartedly on recalling the Incarnation at 6 o'clock with the Angelus. So this thing that I have to do, I will intend to glorify God and make what I have to do an act of worship to God, an act of love to God. I will seek to glorify God on this other thing that I must do. And in that way, my brothers and sisters, we still fulfill then our first obligation to God, because we haven't forgotten him, because we're still thinking about him, even though we're slightly distracted by doing this thing that we have to do. But because we're going to glorify God, because we're intending to glorify God through what we're doing, then it's fine. Even better if we can pray at the same time as doing the thing that we have to do. Then we are still acknowledging and recognizing and prioritizing God and putting him first. And there is nothing, my brothers and sisters, that we that we can do in ordinary life that we cannot love and worship and glorify God through. Nothing at all. There is nothing that we cannot do. There is nothing that cannot be offered to God as a form of sacrificial love, as a form of prayer and praise and adoration. Nothing. Even the most menial task, even scrubbing the loo, or doing the housekeeping, washing dirty dishes, addressing dirty blocked up drains, whatever it is, doesn't matter how menial, doesn't matter how disgusting it is, it is possible to seek to glorify God, which really means, of course, to try to do the best that we can. So whatever the task is, we might strive to do it the best we can in order to glorify God by it, in order to make it an act of love, a demonstration of our love for God. We can say, God, I will, in this task, seek to glorify you. Please accept this act, this task as an act of adoration. Offer it up to him, whatever it is you have to do. It is completely possible to live a life focused, prioritizing God first. Because even those things that are distractions and detractions, but are themselves perhaps obligations and duties and calls upon our time, are perhaps themselves acts of sacrifice. Even these we can sanctify. Even these we can glorify God by working through them and intending to worship him still, intending to glorify him still. And that really is, I've spent half an hour already emphasizing it. I cannot emphasize it enough. But of course, this mindset takes effort until it becomes a part of you, until it becomes natural to you. But you don't have to run away to a monastery or a convent or a retreat house to do this or to develop this, because it really does just take a free exercise of the mind and of the will to want to realize this. It really is really quite simple. And as I say, a ready rule of thumb is always to ask yourself, what is the greatest sacrifice? And that rule of thumb you can use and apply again to any given situation, to any decision you have to make, to any opportunity that arises, to any situation, any problem. You have to decide upon a solution or a course of action. Ask yourself, what is the most sacrificial response? And invariably, my brothers and sisters, that will be the right response. The question, of course, is that having recognized that something requires a sacrifice, having recognized that this would be the greater act of sacrifice, then of course you have to follow through with it. And that, of course, is a challenge. That is challenging. And again, there really is no scenario, there really is no decision that cannot be thought through in this way. And as I've said recently, I think in one of my homilies, and this applies to all the little decisions we make in our daily lives. You know, we make umpteen decisions every second of every minute of every hour of every day. And we are more conscious of them than we care to admit. We are more conscious of them than we care to admit. And again, the point is to strive to ensure the decisions we make are sacrificial by their nature. If we do that, again, generally we can't go wrong. And that is particularly, this is how, you see, it is possible to live a holy life. Because if you choose, in every decision that comes your way through the day, if you choose to sacrifice rather than satisfy self, invariably you will do the right thing. Trust me, try it. Don't take my word for it, try it. But remember, it applies to all the little decisions as well as all the big decisions, all the little choices as well as all the big choices we make. So even those little choices about, about sin, for example, about those little sins, the little sins that we face every day. More often than not, we give into. We've got to change that mindset. We've got to think, so what is the sacrifice? Where is the sacrifice here? Is it denial of myself? It could be, could very well be. Generally speaking, it probably is. Is it denying myself some pleasure? Is it denying myself some selfish satisfaction? If it's sacrificial, if it means sacrificing, it's got to be right. And the point is, when I recognize that and I acknowledge that, then I am making a conscious decision. Especially if I choose not to sacrifice, if I choose not to deny myself. And then, of course, there are the other bigger things that may come along through the day, where a friend calls and asks for help. We know already that invariably the right response will be the one that requires the most sacrifice on our part, to accede to that request or not. But remember that the same is true also of that request of help, any request of help that comes our way from anyone, not just from a loved one, not just from a friend, but also from the stranger. Not forgetting that the stranger may indeed be Christ himself, testing us, proving us, challenging us, encouraging us, enabling us, facilitating us to love sacrificially. But this rule of sacrifice, I promise you, my brothers and sisters, will stand you in good stead if your heart and mind genuinely desire to live in love and in union with God in the pursuit of holiness and righteousness. And you know what's even better about it is when you do the right thing, that nice feeling you have, that good feeling that you have when you've made that sacrifice for somebody else, that heartwarming sensation you feel. You see, God desires that we experience that all the time. That nice feeling we have, that warm, non-selfish but satisfying sense and feeling that we have when we do the right thing, That's all that God desires for us all the time. That is to experience a true sense of happiness in this life. That is almost the forgivable pride. Because sometimes, let's be honest, sometimes when we've done something sacrificial, genuinely sacrificial for someone, and they've responded positively to it, and we do feel sometimes a little sense of pride about it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we should be proud because we've done the right thing. But that sense, that warm sense of happiness, of warmth that we feel when we know we've done the right thing, and when we know that we've performed a genuinely sacrificial act. That's what God is calling us to. That's what God is desiring for us to realize in every moment of our day, in every moment of our lives. And he wants us to, of course, do that for him and for others. And invariably, my brothers and sisters, invariably, you will yourself enjoy making those sacrifices. Now, the question, of course, comes when you don't, or when sometimes you regret. But then, quite frankly, those are the times we need to check ourselves. Those are the times we need to say to ourselves, you know what, actually, you're being selfish. You know what, actually, that's not the right attitude or approach to have. And as I said last Friday, in Contra Mundum, noli timere, be not afraid. Be not afraid to overcome yourself. Be not afraid to deny yourself. Be not afraid to make acts of sacrifice for God and for others. Because in doing so, you will realize true worth, true happiness, true satisfaction. Now, another aspect to the pursuit of holiness that I want to share with you, some practical thoughts upon, was something I mentioned in my homily this morning, and I found the clip. So some of you may recall that I was talking about some Franciscans in the northwest of the country, and particularly of a Franciscan congregation known as the Friars of the Renewal. And I was explaining how they perform what's called a poverty check. Periodically, they will sweep through the friary and get rid of those things that aren't necessary, that are ultimately a distraction or a detraction, that are just weighing things down. So let me play you the clip, and then we'll reflect some more about that afterwards. Now, I think I said this morning that they were in Bolton. They're not actually. They're in Bradford.
Having too much of anything is contrary to the friars' beliefs. Sometimes they need a type of religious spring clean of everything they've been given.
St. Francis encouraged his brothers to live without anything in the world. And today we're going to look at whether we've taken anything on that's extra.
With guidance laid out in the Order's constitution, it's termed a poverty check.
To live a life of voluntary poverty. Do we have anything in the friary that is superfluous or unnecessary for our life and work? Everything in Brother Joshua's room. This also applies to furniture, So any extra furniture that we can liquidate. That armchair I brought down from the loft, not our style. No offense, but it looks like, you know, grandmother's living room style floral print, you know. Anything else?
The CDs and the DVDs. Some of them definitely want to go. Unless anybody really wants to watch RoboCop.
So, kitchen. Tell me what we want, what we don't want. Bing, bang, boom. This guy, cool. This is the giveaway section.
You know, people love that you live a simple life. They love you so much that they give you things. Sometimes gifts that they give you, you know, are not useful.
Ice cream scoopers. Which one do we prefer?
On a couple of occasions,
We did that.
friars have given back to somebody what they gave to us. So,
That's the one to get rid of. Master of Disaster one. Always.
Okay, roger that. Let's just go to the library. So, books. Chickens as pets. I don't know if we want to keep that.
give me that one. I'll send it to the Myersons in New Mexico. She has chickens as pets.
Trees of North America. Animals of the world.
You're getting rid of animals of the world?
I don't know.
I think it's helpful to have some commentary on trees and birds and animals and
These are good, these poverty checks. You can get a lot of superfluous stuff, and it's always books and clothes. But you just find you just stick them in a corner and just like stick more in the corner. Next thing you know, you got a fucking library, you know what I mean?
Poverty check, St. Pio Friary. The journey continues.
And then, of course, they carry on through the friary. They go through the brothers' cells. They're essentially their study bedrooms, and they have to make tough decisions about how really relevant and necessary is this item. Now, the same, my brothers and sisters, is and ought to be true for all of us as Christians. And I'm not saying, and as I've said many times before, we're not all called to be monks and nuns. We're not all called to be religious friars or brothers or sisters, but we are all called to be detached from material things. In other words, that material things do not become the sole focus of our energies and of our time and of our minds and our hearts, particularly our hearts. Now, of course, it's reasonable to and appreciable to accept and to recognize that there are certain things that are absolutely necessary for our lives. There are certain things that perhaps have special meaning to us, which is not detracting from God, but which may, of course, speak to us of a loved one who's passed away, or some occasion of something that we should rightly feel some pride about, perhaps our degree, graduation ceremony, certificate, or photograph, or some commendation from work or service or whatever. That's fine. That all that's fine. We're not talking about that sort of stuff, but it's a good and would be useful exercise for many of us, I'm sure, to do periodically a poverty check, and we might call it a detachment check, to go through our stuff. Now, I need to do a detachment check. Well, not a detachment check, but certainly something of a poverty check. There's a lot of stuff surrounding me right now that I don't need, really, and I ought to think about getting rid of. And the other thing is there, of course, is about that giving away. What the friars do there, the friars run a homeless shelter. And so all the stuff that they've accumulated, they put out for anybody that comes to have lunch to take away, just to have it for free or for nothing, or they'll give it to a charity shop or something like that. So as it were, you can pay it forward. You can perhaps raise some money for a good cause at the same time. But the question we do need, and the thing we need to remind ourselves as Christians, is that what is our primary purpose? What is our primary vocation? It's to live in love and in union with God and to fulfill God's will. And to fulfill God's will, not just for our own lives, but also for others. You know, we are divinely charged and commissioned, each and every one of us, not just sacred ministers, not just clergy, not just religious, not just commissioned missionaries and evangelists. We are all of us charged by the gospel and by Jesus to proclaim his gospel and to bring salvation, to bring the knowledge of salvation and to aid and help others to come to salvation. So likewise then, just as the brothers there were doing in the Friary, when we do a detachment check or when we do a poverty check, we might go through and ask ourselves, right, A, is this necessary? Really necessary? Do I really need this? Does this really mean anything to me? And can I use this in any way to fulfill my vocation or to fulfill God's will? And in what way might this best be used to fulfill God's will? If it doesn't fit my vocation, if it doesn't fit what God's will is for me, perhaps it might fulfill God's will elsewhere. And that's why we might give it to somebody who needs it. That's why we might give it to a cause or for them to use it or to raise money from it. But the spirit of detachment from material things, it's good, my brothers and sisters, for us to regularly check ourselves to ensure that we're not becoming dependent, and we're not becoming reliant, and we're not becoming and all this, you know, with the caveat, unnecessarily attached and unnecessarily dependent, unnecessarily obsessed, or unnecessarily possessive of something. You know, remember that our Lord tells us, and we know it to be true, we can't take any of this stuff with us. We also know it to be true that we have a purpose to our lives. There is a purpose for our existence, which is to know and to realize God's will, to discern God's will, to hone ourselves to God's will. And God's will ultimately is what? Our salvation, that we should live in love and in union with him. So of course we might think, you know, detachment from material things, detachment from those things which might otherwise replace the centrality and the priority of God in our lives and the focus of God in our lives. Those things ought to go. And again, in order to fulfill his will for our lives and his will for us to be a positive influence on the lives of others, in order to fulfill his call and invitation, to make known his call and invitation to them, to come to know his will for them. So then something that, you know, ultimately is not necessary for us, we must ask ourselves, could this be used in some other way for God's will? If not by me, then can this be used by somebody else? And again, by doing this, the whole purpose of this is so that we are reprioritizing again, reorientating our lives back to God, reorientating ourselves back to him, making him the priority, making him the focus of our energy, making him the focus of our time. Because first commandment is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. Second is to love your neighbor. So if I can't use this thing, maybe somebody else can. Then you can give it to your neighbor. Give it to somebody else who can use it, or for a cause that can use it, or get something from it some other way. And this enables us to avoid falling into, essentially the trap of idolatry. We might not think to ourselves, oh, well, I don't worship my laptop, I don't worship my iPhone, I don't worship it. But actually, if it is taking you away, if it is detracting you from, if it is stopping you from worshipping and adoring God as you ought to be, then frankly it is an idol. If it is replacing the focus of your affections from God to it, that is idolatry. That is idolatry. See, many of us perhaps don't even realize sometimes how much we are actually living in contempt of God. You see, all the time we live our lives without assuming the default position of owing our lives to God. Already we are living in contempt of him. If you, at the moment, and you may perhaps be or think yourself a good and holy Christian, but if something in what I've said this evening has made you rethink and thought, oh, okay, actually maybe, no, I need to reorientate my life, and I need to prioritize I need to adopt this new mindset, then be wary, be conscious of the fact then that you have, up until this point, been living somewhat contemptuously of God. If in thinking about what I've said this evening about material things, you've realized, oh, well, actually, I have perhaps spent too much energy, too much focus, too much time and effort to attain this particular material thing, which I've attained for my own benefit and satisfaction, rather than as a tool, not as something that could be used to fulfill God's will for myself or someone else, then you have been and are guilty of idolatry. And again, you might say, well, I didn't know that. I didn't. Well, really, that's for you to sort out with God, isn't it? This is why, my brothers and sisters, it's necessary sometimes for us to take and make a concerted effort and time out to think about these things, for checks and balances, to seriously look at the state and condition of our lives as Christians. This is one of the benefits of, for example, regular confession, availing oneself of the sacrament of penance, and secondly, also of having a spiritual director or a spiritual father, somebody that you go to periodically, that you can, talk about your life and so on and so forth, who may then be able to recognize in what you say faults and failings and things that could be done better, things that need to stop happening, and so on and so forth, in order to bring you back to this default position of putting God first, in order to help you to reorientate and reprioritize your life back to putting God first and center and foremost in your heart and mind, in all your affections. And as I said at the beginning, because once you do that, once you come back, once you're in that default position, it is entirely possible then to be, from that default position, truly and properly love your neighbor, love the other, especially where sacrifice is concerned. Even if it seems to suggest sacrificing, prioritizing God in order to help the other, actually, it just that God loves that because it's an act of sacrifice. And as I say, you can intend even then, with making that act of sacrifice that seems to be detracting from God, and make it all about him. You can still offer it to him. You can still intend to glorify him and to love him through doing it, even if it means not hearing mass or not going to church or whatever. That's how, my brothers and sisters, we can square, as it were, our lives with God. This is how we can live for him and with him, knowing him, loving him, and serving him. It just takes a little more effort on our part to think things through and to apply ourselves, to commit ourselves to doing that which we know is the right thing. And as I say, how do we know when something is the right thing? Because invariably it will require the greatest sacrifice on our part. And sometimes it may seem that that sacrifice is to detract from God. But actually, even then, that act of sacrifice is an act of sacrifice for God. And you can intend to make it an act of sacrifice for him, even when you are serving somebody else. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the right way for various, people in good conscience. There are many Christians that I've spoken to over the years, people of good conscience who, because of work, because of their job, because of caring responsibilities, because of various appreciable things, have worried themselves and been overly concerned that they haven't been fulfilling the first commandment of putting God first because they've had to do these other things. But the truth is, if you're starting already from recognizing that the first true call and duty on your time is for God, but if it's necessary that you have to do this other thing, then you can still do that other thing, but intend it for God. Make it the thing that is a duty, because then that is a sacrifice. And God is love. God is caritas. God is charity. God is sacrificial love. So any act of sacrifice, any act of sacrificial love is always going to be pleasing to him. And for those that might still have some scruples, remember that a humble and contrite heart the Lord will not despise. And that's the great beauty, of course, about our faith, is that God is merciful. We should never presume upon his mercy. We should never assume his mercy, but we should trust in his mercy. We should believe in his mercy. We should know his mercy. So just lastly, I'm just going to say self-examination of conscience. It's a good discipline to have every day before going to bed. Practice just a few moments of self-examination of conscience, which is basically to reflect on the past day and think to yourself, recall to mind those times when you did not put God first, and then say you're sorry. Is to recall through the day those times when you didn't act sacrificially for another when you could have done, or you didn't act sacrificially for God when you could have done, and say sorry, and trust and believe that God will accept your apology as long as it is sincere, as long as it is genuine. And if it's concerning perhaps a mortal sin, then avail yourself, for goodness sake, avail yourself of the sacrament of penance. Go to confession. But know, my brothers and sisters, that if you are genuinely sorry and contrite and you make an act of contrition, God will hear that and God will think favorably of it. But it may be for the settlement of scruples, perhaps seek out sacramental confession so that again you can know, by hearing the words of absolution, you know that God has heard you. But in these ways, my brothers and sisters, it's just, you see, a little change in the way we think. Or for some of us, it may require a bigger change in the way we think. And it's something that we can all do, though, and we all ought to do, though. Whatever our status in life, whatever our situation in life, whatever our circumstances in life, whether we're rich or poor, whether we're retired or full-time employed, it doesn't matter. All of us, as Christians, should be living, putting God first as our default position, and otherwise living sacrificially for him and for others. That is to live a truly righteous and Christian life. And you will feel the better for it. You will feel more satisfied. You will feel more complete by fulfilling God's will in this way. Bless you for watching. I hope that was interesting and useful for you. Always welcome to feedback. Always welcome to answer questions. Please don't hesitate. You can do so in the comments, through Facebook, or through the profiles on whatever platform you're watching. You can message me directly. Tomorrow, of course, 8:30 Mass, 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock Angelus, and Rosary tomorrow evening. You're always most welcome to join me online as we seek to offer God sacrificial love in praise and adoration of him. Meanwhile, take care and God bless you.